So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's watching. And this is Middle East Insights, and my name is Dr. Shubhda Chaudhary. And in our international dialogue series, we are going to speak about weaponization of politics in the Indo-Pacific. And for that, we have a very, very esteemed geopolitical expert, commentator, and author, Dr. Swasti Rao, who is joining us. She is Associate Professor and Associate Dean at Global Initiatives, Jindal School of International Affairs at OP Jindal Global University. She is also the Consulting Editor, International and Strategic Affairs at ThePrint. She is Geopolitical Advisor and Defense Consultant to Ministry of Defense for UP Defense Corridor. She has been under 40 Young Leader EICBI for India-Europe Relations. She is also, which I don't need to introduce all of you with, she's also the host of Worldview with Swasti at ThePrint. Along with that, she has been recognized as geopolitical expert by the government of UP for G20 Summit in 2023. She is a regular commentator on IR across national and international media platforms. Along with that, she had worked at the prestigious Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, MPIDSA, which is India's premier think tank under the aegis of Ministry of Defense. There, she worked on projects for Ministry for External Affairs and Ministry of Defense on European politics and geoeconomics and geopolitics. Her research project at MPIDSA has been on conflicts in Europe amidst shifting power structures and Europe's Indo-Pacific outreach. So with this, thank you so much, ma'am, for the privilege of your time and gracing us with your presence. I would like to give you the platform to explain that how do you see Indo-Pacific being weaponized, especially in terms of so much of power of the arms lobby, so many territorial disputes, superpower competition, and above all, the kind of conflicts and wars that the world has been ravished in for the past more than 3 years.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Shubhda. I hope I'm loud and clear to everybody. And thank you for this opportunity. I've always loved my interactions with you. And it's just great that finally we've been able to work out a time when I can address, all these curious young minds through your platform. So thank you so much for the opportunity. Now, quickly, I think I have what I've done is that I have just tried to simplify the subject. Let me just have a minute to just explain the vastness of the subject, and one runs the risk of getting really lost into the vast expanse of Indo-Pacific and the many, many dimensions that it has today, and especially the many strategically relevant dimensions that it has today for India and for the rest of the world. Now, just to simplify that, what I've done is that I will start with a bit of construct of what Indo-Pacific is all about. I will tell you about the key players, of course. I will tell you why has it become the arena of great power contestation, like we all know. And then I will tell you what exactly is the weaponization here all about. So as Dr. Shubhda also mentioned in her opening remarks, that this region has become prey to a weaponization of almost everything, which is almost unfolding in a parallel way as world is mired into long-standing conflicts. So we will talk a little bit about that, and then I will talk about how the responses are getting shaped up. I would like to also hear from all of you. So I'll try to sort of, narrow it down in my initial sort of remarks, but feel free to ask me whatever you deem fit. So like I said, that if I just start with the construct, as you know, that Indo-Pacific is a vast maritime oceanic space. And basically what it envisions is that it envisions the confluence of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. From India's perspective, India's Indo-Pacific strategy started to get formed after 2015, particularly because we started what is known as the Sagar Doctrine, which is security and growth for all in the region. While India's primary focus has been the Indian Ocean region for very obvious reasons, but we will see how that kind of got expanded to the larger Indo-Pacific region as well. And after Sagar, we in 2018 came up with the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which if you look at the pillars, if you 7 pillars, you will see how India envisions Indo-Pacific to be free, open, and inclusive. So that in many ways gives you the flavor of how India looks at Indo-Pacific. Just a little bit here worth mentioning is that from India's perspective, there has been a considerable shift in the last 20 years from having merely a maritime strategy, which was focused on how to use the seas, to a maritime vision now, which is more focused on how to secure the seas. And from India's perspective, that entails a huge journey, a long journey from being merely a country that is looking after its coasts and looking after its economic interest in the region to a country that is now becoming a preferred security partner, etc., in the larger, backdrop of how the great power contestation is unfolding. So just keep that in mind, that there is a journey that India has played into this last 2 decades. Now, very quickly, why is it that the Indo-Pacific is important? See, Indo-Pacific is not important only now. Indo-Pacific has always been important because of the choke points. It has the Malacca Strait, it has the Sunda Strait, and I hope all of you already know where those, the choke points are, in the South China Sea, near the ASEAN region, But what has happened is that the attention that Indo-Pacific has started to gain, and all these things that you keep hearing and referring to in terms of great power contestation and Quad and plurilaterals, etc., I think all of this is basically Xi Jinping's gift to the world, because when Xi Jinping took over the leadership of the Communist Party in 2012, and in 2013 launched the ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. After that, in 2015, when he started with a very ambitious modernization of the People's Liberation Army Navy, People's Liberation Army Air Force, so on and so forth, created a strategic force command, so many things. He started theaterization. He started building artificial islands in the South China Sea in 2014, 2015. So it was this particular posture that, China sort of gained under Xi Jinping that became extremely important, and how the rest of the country started to bother about why Indo-Pacific, the rules-based order in Indo-Pacific and freedom of navigation, etc., needs to be protected. Now, the other thing that I need all of you to remember before we go on to the next part is that today where we stand is that while India envisions a multipolar Asia and a multipolar Indo-Pacific, China, on the contrary, envisions a unipolar Asia and a unipolar Indo-Pacific, even though it entails a multipolar world, which means to say that from China's perspective, the only fitting peer in this region is the United States. For everybody else, China, considers them a junior partner. So this is a fundamental disjunct in how we really look at the region. And this is also one of the reasons why there has been tension. And this is, again, one of the reasons why India then likes to collaborate with many like-minded partners. The other key takeaway that I want you to remember is that unlike the Euro-Atlantic space, where you have something like a NATO, which is a collective security guarantor kind of an organization, you don't have anything like that in the Indo-Pacific. So Indo-Pacific is this vast oceanic space which is at the confluence of two major seas with so many actors, with so much of destabilization that I just told you about from China's perspective, and yet you do not have anything that really binds the security anxieties of the region together. And one of the reasons why you see the kind of weaponization that you see in the Indo-Pacific region today is also due to the fact that you do not have an overarching security, alliance. In fact, today, when we refer to as building more responses in terms of tackling security challenges in the Indo-Pacific, we really have to look at in terms of building collaborative frameworks, because in the years that followed after 2013 to now, which is a little more than a decade, what you've seen is that China's rise has been destabilizing. China has championed its hold on the region by keeping a lot of countries and key countries in the region divided, and therefore they do not want to take sides. So, and therefore you see the kind of security architecture, a bit here and there, a bit, floating, a bit fluid, for a particular reason, because you really cannot come up with anything like the NATO here. It will just not work in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, I'm just skipping the part of how the idea first came to everybody's notice from Shinzo Abe, who was late Shinzo Abe, who was Japanese Prime Minister's speech at the Indian Parliament. I'll just give it a skip, because we can always take it up later if any of you is interested in knowing where the concept is coming from. But what I wish to tell you is that the key actor here will certainly be Donald Trump, and his first administration when he came about in 2016. He came and he withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018. He promised to end the wars. And he said that Obama's pivot to Asia is not really very useful because it has not really been able to tackle the Chinese growing assertiveness in the region. And therefore, he's decided to focus on Indo-Pacific, and he brought many changes. He deepened cooperation with Asia-Pacific partners of the Indo-Pacific region, for Asia-Pacific partners of the US. So, for example, he deepened cooperation with countries like Japan, Taiwan, of course, India, South Korea, etc. What he also did, that he changed the name of the PACOM, which was Pacific Command, to Indo-Pacific Command. And he started to deploy more aircraft carriers. And in fact, if somebody wants to know, I can give you an entire list. Just to keep things simple, right now the US has about 3 aircraft carriers in the Indo-Pacific, and it plans to deploy 2 more. So according to 2025 updates, the US is likely to have about 5 of its 11 aircraft carriers in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, I also have a lot of detail on how the US has been shifting its resources from different commands to the Indo-Pacific Command. And in fact, I also have a bit of a elaboration on the recent US focus on CENTCOM, especially how the US went after Iran, sided with Israel, and carried out the Operation Midnight Hammer by dropping these unprecedented bombs on Iran, etc. And therefore, a lot of people started to argue that the US is shifting focus from Indo-Pacific Command to back to CENTCOM. But then there are also a lot of other data to sort of argue that, at least for the time being, it doesn't look as if Trump is completely diluting his, attention. But all that can be, talked about later. I can tell you more about those deployments and more about your commands. But I want to come to the main body, which is that, all of this has happened when you look at how Beijing's investments and activities in the region have gradually and consistently grown since the first anti-piracy deployment to Indian Ocean in 2008. And after that, it's just grown. And after 2013, there's a spurt, in China's activities. So there's no point actually telling you the obvious. I have a lot of images and graphs on where all the Chinese military presence in the IOR region, in the wider Indo-Pacific region are. But that's something that's like reiterating the obvious. What I want to come back is that when you look at destabilization here in the region, and that's the main body of the thought, today's presentation, is that what I consider destabilization is directly related to how there is a phenomena of everything being weaponized. So whether it's military, of course, by definition, that's weaponized, that's very normal. But there's also, the economic statecraft, which is used for military sort of objectives. And then there is this widespread gray zone that we should be talking more about. And frankly, we do not talk more about. So as you know, that China has 9-line claims. It claims a lot of regions of the South China Sea, and that's why it's always a flashpoint. It has created artificial islands. I already told you about. It has been very frequently infiltrating the Taiwanese airspaces. You know that according to Xi Jinping, he wants to leave a legacy of the grand Chinese reunification, and 2027 seems to be a kind of a deadline there. We will see how it pans out. But if you look at the Chinese build-up and generally the Chinese military build-up, it's very clear that Xi Jinping, if he decides to take away Taiwan by force, there is frankly nothing stopping him, because we also saw by way of the Russia-Ukraine war and the fact that the US was not wanting to support Europe in their fight, for Ukraine. Also, sort of somewhere gives kind of a leeway to China in case they want to do something similar in Taiwan. It's just that the costs would be significantly higher because of China's economic sort of dependence on the world, and also the world's economic dependence on China. So, but that said, that their infiltration has grown by hundreds. It's like hundreds and hundreds of times every year, and very little can be done about it. I mean, no U.S. aircraft presence in that region is helping it. Okay, no Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan has been able to help it. Similarly, you see a very frequent aggression against Philippines. That's also been one of the reasons why Philippines landed up buying BrahMos missiles from India, and Philippines has been building on its, defense readiness. But frankly, if there was a war in the Taiwan Straits, just Philippine defense readiness alone would not really serve any purpose. It has to be a coordinated response. And the large question is that are the people that are on the other side of the divide, which is that want to uphold a rules-based order and freedom of operation, etc., are willing to have a coordinated response or not. And for that, we all have a huge strategic ambiguity answer from most big players in the region, whether it's France or whether it's European Union, from the US, whoever that may be, including India. Similarly, very recently, Chinese aggression has been growing. They went inside the Australian EEZ as late as February 2025. As far as the Korean air identification zone is concerned, they have been transgressing that as well. And then, of course, there's another phenomena that has emerged lately after the Russia's war in Ukraine, which is the joint exercises with Russia have taken a huge fillip, because one of my arguments is that even though Russia is not really a relevant player in the Indo-Pacific, what has happened after the long-standing war in Ukraine and Russia's growing dependence on China for fiscal support and dual-use support and all of that, we do see a concerning development in the Indo-Pacific, where the Chinese and the Russian, strategic convergence has really seen a kind of an intensification, which was not there earlier. Similarly, China keeps dividing ASEAN. There are different ways in which it divides ASEAN. One of the ways I will tell you about, I did tell you about Philippines, okay, but what you also need to remember is that the collective trade between China and ASEAN is to the tune of $962 billion annual, and this is 2024 data. Naturally, with this kind of a humongous trade, China remains the most important trading partner to ASEAN, and even though there are countries in ASEAN like Singapore that have a more visible Western tilt, but at the same time, the ASEAN does not want to take a clear-cut position, especially when it comes to strategic or military posturing against China. So that has been one of the things. Now, other things is that, especially under Donald Trump 2.0, China is also very quick at exploiting vulnerabilities by way of how the Western alliance seems fractured and the fault lines seem obvious between Trump on the one hand and Europe on the other hand. So obviously, and of course, why not mention South Korea and Japan? Because if you've been following the developments in those regions, both South Korea and Japan are extremely upset about Donald Trump's tariff behavior, the punitive tariff measures against, those countries. And now there's one thing that I would like to mention, which is that most recently, what Beijing has been doing and has been doing in a very, I would say, unabashed manner, is that they have been unveiling gray zone capabilities. And I can give you a recent example from today itself, where they laser targeted one of Germany's aircraft, which was taking part in a European Union's mission. And I'll tell you more about that. Apart from that, you also see a weaponization of information. There is a huge problem of disinformation in the region today. Most states in the region, like the Pacific Island countries, etc., the less developed, countries within ASEAN, including countries and also countries like India, for instance, and different countries in South Asia, they do not have capabilities to really fight disinformation and all the gray zones. So this is something which really we need to, be looking at. And finally, there is this axis that the West says, the CRINC axis, which is, the coming together of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. To my mind, and, with my analysis, I would not say it's that kind of a binary. Of course, there are also internal, internal difference of degrees, and I will take questions in case you're interested. But at least we do see that there is a rising cooperation and convergence among certain countries led by China that are forming a very anti-Western alliance. Now, the India's role out there is to try and make it, try and retain the non-Western flavor, because from India's perspective, anything which is non-Western is fine. But anti-Western is something that India lately has steered clear of, as our trade and defense cooperation, etc., kind of keeps growing with a lot of Western countries as well. So, we are doing the classic balancing out there. And just as I wanted to tell you a little bit about, more about economic statecraft, please remember that even closer home in South Asia, because we're talking about the Indian Ocean region, which is a kind of a subset of the larger Indo-Pacific region, all countries with the exception of Bhutan are signatories to the BRI. Of course, China plays all sides in Myanmar. China is a key stakeholder in Myanmar. China is a key stakeholder in Afghanistan. It also maintains its continental depth in South Asia, particularly with, from India's perspective, it doesn't let Pakistan get destabilized enough beyond a point because of its investments in CPEC, which is very obvious. So there is a China, Pakistan, Afghanistan trilateral that we keep saying. Similarly, I mentioned that China is already the biggest trading partner to ASEAN and keeps using that economic dependency weaponized and, ASEAN divided. Also in the Pacific Islands, at least 11 Pacific Island countries have not just diplomatic ties with China, but they are also engaged in Belt and Road Initiative projects. And these countries, you may have heard their names, countries like Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, the Solomon Islands, Kiribati, Papua New Guinea, Cook Islands, and so many of them. I'm forgetting a few names. So you do see that. Similarly, you do see that China is the biggest trading partner to both New Zealand and Australia. Australia, of course, has started to have a different approach to their security, but frankly, New Zealand doesn't really agree with it, even though New Zealand and Australia, both of them happen to have security alliances with the US. But under Donald Trump, the unpredictability that is perpetuated in the world also kind of goes against their reliance on the US, and obviously they question it. So this is how, in many ways, China keeps the entire region destabilized by weaponizing almost everything, not just the military presence, which by definition is very easy to understand, but also false claims, disinformation, economic statecraft, etc., etc. Now, when you look at responses, and this is the last part of my presentation today, the responses also vary, and the responses vary because I told you at the outset that unlike the Euro-Atlantic theater, we do not really have a collective security organization like the here, and we cannot have. As a result, what we see is the space gets very, very crowded. And if you look at the responses, there is a hard response. And that hard response basically forms the body of the great power contestation, which is China on the one hand and United States on the other hand. And I told you about certain capabilities that they deploy to the region. Now, United States is not alone here. It is also sort of backed by the UK. And when I talk about the UK, within brackets, I also talk about the status of AUKUS, which could be in trouble. You never know. The US, UK, and Australia, alliance on building nuclear submarines. So we still have to see how that pans out. But largely, UK is supported very clearly by UK. US is supported very clearly by UK in this growing power contestation. There are also non-military responses to this particular weaponization. The non-military responses are championed by players like the European Union. I have worked a lot in European Union. You can ask me questions on that if you want. And other member state countries, especially France, that maintain a permanent presence in the region because they have EEZ, they have 1.5 million citizens, etc. So, France has been a resident Indo-Pacific power. And when we talk about the West, for the longest time, India was most comfortable in converging with France because of its historic ties and also a lot of reliability and trust, but also because of the fact that France had a legit claim on being in the Indo-Pacific. Okay, then of course UK also had 5 power defense agreements with many countries in ASEAN. But the UK's role lately has been shrinking, and it is getting pretty much kind of, under the shadow of the US. I mean, they are coming up with major doctrinal changes in their policies, but ultimately it is a question of resources. So we will see how that pans out. So in the non-military space, like I said, European Union has an Indo-Pacific strategy. They have the EU NAVFOR, the EU Naval Force missions, such as Operation Atalanta. India has been on board and Operation Atalanta, and also Operation Aspides. In fact, today, the fact that China laser targeted one of Germany's warships, that particular warship was actually participating in the operation as Peters. Okay, so these are EU NAVFOR operations. And then the EU also has a maritime tool called the Coordinated Maritime Presence. By and large, the flavor of EU's engagement to Indo-Pacific is more about giving a third way forward, not really militarizing the space so much, because, the EU is not really a military actor, especially in this region, even though it is getting transformed now and back in its own continent. But here it remains very, very, non-militaristic. And similarly for France as well, you will see that France is trying to give a third way forward by more engagement, by more mainstreaming of these countries, by getting them involved in more, the global gateway projects and other connectivity projects along with Japan, etc. So you see that kind of a flavor when it comes to the non-military responses, which in many ways kind of, the European Union champions. And then, of course, I can get into the details of what are the different differences in different member states countries. So, of course, the Scandinavian countries are also getting interested in Indo-Pacific, etc. If you want, you can ask a question on that. I don't see a reason to elaborate on it right now. Then we also have NATO engaging Indo-Pacific more and more, especially after 2022, when during their annual summit in Spain, in Madrid, they came up with a key document which is called the strategic concept. So NATO comes out with a particular document every 10 years. And in the 2022 document, which was released merely months after Russia's war in Ukraine, they talked about China becoming number one challenger. And as a result, they said that NATO is going to have a more 360-degree view and not just talk about, European security, etc. And therefore, under the strategic concept, it is going to be engaging more with the disruptive use of AI, disinformation, climate challenges, gray zone sort of challenges in the Indo-Pacific region, because it, for the first time, listed China as one of the most important challengers. Now, despite that, and having said that, from India's perspective, we have seen that India-NATO dialogue, at least at the informal level, has been happening in the last 2-3 years, especially on the sidelines of the Raisina dialogue in New Delhi. But if you ask me, there's still very, very little development on it, because NATO's engagement of the Indo-Pacific, especially from India's perspective, remains something which is controversial, and it is not understood here well, because NATO is not coming here to increase their members. NATO is coming here because the theaters are merging. And I told you that there is a phenomena of the Chinese and the Russian threat coming together for Europe. India, of course, that plays balancer. Not just that, as North Korea is fighting in Ukraine, there's another way in which those theaters are, the security concerns are merging, so on and so forth, of course. So because of all that, the NATO has this concept, but I have not seen any real allocation of any, respectable resources in order, or having any game plan as to how that engagement is going to pan out. But for sure, they have a strategic concept, and whenever there is the right time, they will follow that through, because the strategic concept is like a 10-year long vision document. Similarly, you have Quad, of course. There's a reason why I did not talk about Quad enough, because we all know about Quad. The question that is relevant for Quad is that will it develop more teeth under Donald Trump or not? And that is something that we will come to know soon when India will be hosting the Quad Summit later this year. Now, very quickly, this is my last point, which is that I am of the opinion that when we talk about Indo-Pacific and the weaponization of almost everything, there is way too much focus on the possibility of an all-out war. I mean, I have been part of many, many scenario buildings where the possibility of an all-out war is constantly being discussed, and what would be the scenarios that would then emerge. On the contrary, I'm of the opinion that while the possibility of an all-out war still remains etched in future, we do not know whether we are really getting there or not. Right now, the biggest, destabilizing factor in the Indo-Pacific is the gray zone. And it is at the gray zone that we should be developing more coordinated response. So we do have a lot of, I would say, engagements on maritime domain awareness. And why did I mention maritime domain awareness? Why did I underline it? is because when you are trying to develop a hybrid security architecture in a vast maritime space such as the Indo-Pacific, you certainly need to have maritime domain awareness, because end of the day, remember, it's a maritime space. So we need that. Just the IFC-IOR alone won't suffice, because IFC-IOR is basically sort of partnering on white shipping, and white shipping alone doesn't really suffice the kind of gray zone challenges and the threat to critical undersea cables and infrastructure that exists today. It requires doing more than that. It requires a systematic and well-planned investment in underwater drone capabilities, underwater surveillance capabilities, which has to be steered by the big actors in the region. So while the US is doing something, but like I said, that US's presence in the region is always looked upon as something which is destabilizing, because somewhere it is sort of reinforces the great power contestation. So my argument is that the countries that have a non-militaristic outlook towards the Indo-Pacific, that talk about a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, like India. I mean, of course, we don't have identical convergences with our partners, but we have high degree of convergences and low degree of convergences. So we have to basically formulate a coordinated response, not just in outputs, not just in like separate, segregated dialogue mechanisms with the EU somewhere, with Japan somewhere, with Australia somewhere, not like that. We need a more coordinated response. And I have been of the opinion, I've been writing a lot, which is that India needs to join hands with countries actors like the EU, like Australia, like Japan, and actually put together something like a hybrid center where a coordinated response can be meted out. And I say that because the European Union in Helsinki has a center of excellence on hybrid threats, which really looks after the destabilization in the Baltics, in the Baltic region, of NATO and the Baltic Sea, etc. And the eastern flank, which has traditionally been very vulnerable compared to other parts of Europe. So they have the expertise. Obviously, they cannot be replicating it 100% when they come to Indo-Pacific. In fact, the beginning has already been made. And the first, response with the first center, such center from the European side has been opened in Australia. And if you look carefully, you will see that India has extremely meaningful conversations with countries like Australia, countries like, Japan. So the idea is, why not just put it together in a way that can really sort of, take care of the vulnerability that sort of overwhelms the region today, not something which is etched in the future. So that is something that I've been, saying. And just as a last thought, I could say that India is doing all of that in the Indo-Pacific, and to also break out from the encirclement that we see by China, and especially how sort of, we see a weaponization of everything in Indo-Pacific. What I also see, something which is germinating now, is that India is now talking about creating a confluence between Indo-Pacific and the Indo-Mediterranean. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I think I've already sort of overshot my time. So I will just end here, but that's my key takeaway. Which is that we should be focusing much more seriously on hybrid threats and look at it in terms of a coordinated, structured response with like-minded partners. And on the other hand, that we are reimagining sort of breaking out of that encirclement by connecting the Indo-Pacific to the Indo-Mediterranean. And I stop at Indo-Mediterranean. I don't go all the way to Arctic, because if you start talking like that, then the whole world becomes, a bit of a hodgepodge. So right now, I do see that there is a lot of granular detailing that one can see in terms of how these two regions are getting connected. And in my opinion, it's a very good strategy, because it allows for, a strategic space for India to sort of break out of that encirclement. IMEC has been one of the ways in which we have been trying to do it. It has not worked because of the situation in West Asia. But then there are other ways also, as we are developing more and more strategic gateways into Europe. There's a reason why we're doing that. So there's a reason I say that, because China's 17+1 mechanism has not really worked there. So it's not just China sort of, isolating India in our part of the world, but there are also ways in which we can counterbalance this by looking at Indo-Mediterranean. So I end here, but I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And for our scholars, I would like to say that there are two pertinent reasons why I always find her very inspiring. One is that there is a gap between public policy making, understanding, and academia. And through the work that she does, she is trying to bridge that gap. That is one thing which is very rare. The recent Geopolitics with Swasti episode is out, and I've shared it in the group. The second reason is also that just by being and talking and researching and doing all the scenario building that she's doing, it's also inspiring to a lot of young women students and scholars as an ambition in future. So these are two very essential aspects of it. And now we'll start taking up with the questions. Those who want to ask a question can text it in the chat box. My first question to you, ma'am, is that Z has been absent from public view since May 2025. He skipped the BRICS summit also.
Yeah.
At the same time, there is dissent from party elders and princelings. There was an open letter in December 2024 listing 28 errors and demanding Z to resign. In retaliation of that, there have been a lot of arrests going on in China as we speak. At the same time, there is weak growth, deflation, and a shrinking population. That does challenge China, especially the real estate sector's collapse, and also the debt crisis and youth unemployment that is growing in China. Do you think that this internal domestic dissent and changes would create any challenge for Z?
All right, Shobhita, do you want me to take this question now? You want to add another question? I can take it as together. One by one?
Okay.
All right. Yeah, so you're right. Actually, it has fueled a lot of speculation as to why Xi Jinping sort of, for the first time ever since he actually came to power, has missed the BRICS summit, which is happening, in Brazil. So yes, it has fueled a lot of speculation. Now, China being an opaque system that it is obviously very difficult to find a confirmatory explanation. The Chinese official narrative would always try to downplay it. And, people like us who are really directly threatened by China's wolf warrior diplomacy would always try to find more about it. I think there is no doubt about the fact that there are many internal challenges in China. Many of those you mentioned. Chinese economy is not everything is not hunky-dory. It's true. Also, because as the world becomes more and more aware of China's debt trap diplomacy, the world becomes more and more aware of China's overcapacity and all that. You do see that there is not everything is the way it was, for China. That's one part. The other thing is that while right now, we do not see the internal problems reflecting on China's capability to power project. Okay, so please just keep in mind what I'm saying, which is that despite the internal struggles and the problems and the aging, because China is now also demographically aging, and that's where India is certainly scores a much higher point than China. Despite all of that, so far we do not see that translating into China's ability to power project. Okay, affecting China's ability to power project. The official reasons given are that Xi needs to be, there internally. He is preparing for a big CCP political summit later in the year, and therefore he needs to be there. So we will see how it pans out. The fact that China today is having these problems, of course, makes it interesting for us to study. But I honestly do not subscribe to many of these theories that are floating, which is that Xi Jinping's days are numbered, or Xi Jinping, CCP is not happy with them. And that's another problem. If he knows how to sort of hold it together. His rhetoric, if you look at the rhetoric inside China, I'm not an expert on what is happening on the domestic side of China. I, of course, focus more on their power projections in the rest of the world, and also their weapons, etc., and all the destabilization that they do for India, their weapons industry cooperation with Pakistan, with Azerbaijan, with Turkey, and those are the things that I really work on. But I just want to sort of somewhere point out this caveat, which is that if Xi Jinping feels that his legitimacy is under some kind of a threat, it actually creates more incentive for him to do to really go that extra mile on Taiwan. So we just need to be careful of how this very, very fragile balance is going to pan out, because a lack of that power projection, but at the same time, we understand that not everything is hunky-dory. And yet we do see that there are, despite all that, it is China that is giving all the weapons supplies to Iran now, not Russia. It is China that is now co-developing fighter jets with Pakistan and selling them to Azerbaijan, not Russia. So from that respect, I honestly would be very careful and would take these arguments with a pinch of salt, because perhaps if he runs the risk of becoming unpopular back home, it creates more incentive for him to leave his legacy. Remember, he's a very tough man, his father was imprisoned during the Cultural Revolution. He himself went to prison during the Cultural Revolution. His mother was insulted, by Mao's, Red Army. His sister was killed. He has seen all of that up close, and yet he chose to sort of become a member of the CCP and then rise up the ranks. So he's there to prove himself. He's there to prove himself. He's also there to prove to the rest of the world and to CCP, as they complete 100 years of their existence in 2027, that it's him and not Mao who is going to be the greatest leader for China, because he keeps underlining all the Mao's, blunders. For example, in the 1962 war, when he gave up claims on, when China gave up claims on what they had won from India, so on and so forth. So please keep that in mind, that for Xi Jinping, the most important legacy will be the grand unification of China. And that perhaps is the magic ingredient that he thinks that he has. And if he runs the risk of losing popularity, there will certainly be a kind of a rhetoric that he will then try to whip up. Does that mean good news for us or bad news for us? It depends on how prepared we are, So ultimately, everything boils down to just how prepared we are. And as far as our own preparedness is concerned, I would say that it's not all great news, particularly after what we saw, the kind of bonhomie, the kind of, military deepening that we saw coming from Pakistan, China, Pakistan, Turkey. That's certainly not good news for us. So, just to reiterate, I've been going on and on. It was a difficult question, but just to sort of reiterate and to conclude, my basic point is that how we respond to China is going to be determined less by whether or not China has internal disturbances or not, but whether or not we have the capabilities, individually as well as with other partners. So that is where we should be focusing more on. Otherwise, what happens inside China is frankly less to do with what we can do right away.
Yeah, I do agree with you. And the entire model of a president or a prime minister to instill and cement his leadership, waging a war on another territory, is not new. We have the model going on. And Anurag is asking that given the increasing assertiveness of China in the Indo-Pacific, isn't it time for India to shed its hesitancy and up the military aspect of Quad in protection of free, open, inclusive Indo-Pacific?
Well, Anurag, thanks for that question. If you ask my personal views on it, I would say I'm a hawk, and I would always push India to single-mindedly develop more military capabilities. We are a far too politicized community. We are far too democratic. Please take it with a pinch of salt. I do not mean that we should junk our democracy. But what I mean to say is that for far too long, India has remained in the shackles of bureaucratic red tapeism, in the shackles of not having a national security strategy, in the shackles of not really defining our threats around more clearly. And with the way the security situation, not just in the Indo-Pacific and not just with respect to China's larger destabilization, for Taiwan, for the Korean Air Identification Zone, for Japan, East, military activities in the Sea of Japan. It's not just got to do with that. If you just look closer home, the kind of encircling that we see, I think we really need to shed a lot of our own inhibitions of the past, because we are no longer living in that world. We are no longer living in a world which is governed by Hu Jintao. Do you remember that Xi Jinping was holding one of key posts in the Hu Jintao period? When the rest of us were thinking that Hu Jintao, China is very peaceful under Hu Jintao, and when Xi Jinping became the leader, when he replaced Hu Jintao, he actually started doing everything that he started to plan in 2006 and onwards. So China plays the long game, and for us, I agree with you that for tackling a very defiant, a much more superior, something like a Communist Party. And, please remember, the Communist Party of China doesn't really believe in an all-out war. For them, the all-out war, a conventional war, a military kinetic war, is the last stage of their warfare. The first stage of their warfare is the war that they start playing in the cognitive realm, the war that they start playing with your mind, the war they start playing through their economic statecraft, through their debt trap, through their satellite, grip over you. Do you know that during Operation Sindoor, China was making real-time images of Pakistan, of Pahalgam, etc., and also, the region where our aircrafts were operating all the time to Pakistan? I mean, China has more than 1,000 military satellites in space. India has how many? Not even 10. Now we are deciding that we will invest in 52 satellites. So please remember that for countering an adversary such as China on the one hand, Pakistan on the other hand, and the China-Pakistan destabilization now affecting Bangladesh on the third front, I mean, we really need to shed our inhibitions. And I have been a critic of how India traditionally, after 1947, has conflated status with power, because in my opinion, there can be no real status without having real power. And real power is simple. Real power is not soft. Soft power follows. Real power is economic capabilities and military capabilities. So in these two aspects, and particularly in the military sphere right now, we really need to up our game. And of course, that cannot be done because for developing anything, you need money, right? So the economic capabilities go hand in hand. But I completely agree with you that we need to shed some part of that inhibition. We can't really go completely militaristic for a reason. And the reason is that we have far too many destabilization in the continental domain. So from China's perspective, China wants to keep India engaged at the LSE. Remember, even at the LSE, they don't want an all-out war with us. Why do you think that they go into the salami slicing? Okay, that's because they want to keep us engaged in this region, and so that they know that in the time of Taiwan crisis, at least a country like India wouldn't have an incentive to really do something very clearly to support the West. And frankly, the way Donald Trump administration is panning out right now, of course, there is nothing stopping Xi Jinping from taking Taiwan on a weekend he chooses to take. So things are very complicated. The Indo-Pacific region is very, very serious, and we can all hope for the best but prepare for the worst. The question is, are we preparing for the worst? So even if not complete militarization, which is a very, very extreme part of what you're saying, even though I agree with you in principle, I would suggest that we need very, very robust planning, and we need to make sure that this is done. Right. So we take a decision and we follow it through is what we need to do. We take a lot of decisions, but a lot of times they're not able to see the light of the day. And that's where my problem is.
Yeah, I agree with you in terms of the cognitive aspect of how psychological operations and warfare are carried out in today's day and age. Gaurang is asking a question, which is that can you elaborate the strategic differences between weaponization of the Asia-Pacific during Cold War and Indo-Pacific region in the so-called New Cold War, if that is the correct terminology to be used?
Yeah. So during Cold War, particularly, of course, there was, you can understand in many ways that when you're talking about the Cold War, it was primarily to do with a military sort of an arms race, right? And it was all about, a sphere of influence. So influence and an arms race, okay? And that arms race unfolded in the number of nuclear missiles each side had, the number of, who gets to space first, etc. So it had that kind of a nature. So it was also during the Cold War that the US actually got into this policy of having forward deployments and forward bases. And that's why US maintains, dozens and dozens of forward bases. Because if you look at the US, maritime frontiers, you understand that the main threat to US is not really coming from its own maritime frontiers, but US's power in the region, power in the world is actually projected through the bases it maintains in different parts of the world, which certainly has a very, very Cold War legacy. So if I'm able to convey myself, what I mean to say that the original Cold War had, a few easy to understand dimensions, which was, the military arms race, forward deployments, both from the USSR side and from this side, enlargement of NATO. There was a curtain, iron curtain that fell after German unification and fall of Soviet Union. Economy, yes, there was a bit of not really much of a race in economy, because the Soviet economic model was frankly very, very faulty. And before it disintegrated politically, the Soviet Union had already disintegrated economically, so there was a major problem there. So I would not really count economy as a major factor for Soviet Union. But you did see that the Cold War geopolitics played out in several theaters of the world, and of course, South Asia being one. So our entire 1971 war and the kind of the treaty with the Soviet Union that we signed, and frankly, all the weapons dependence that we then started to have, all has a Cold War context. Okay, the reason why India was not a signatory to NPT and later on, had to face sanctions, etc., all had the Cold War, connotation there. But after the Cold War has ended, and if you're talking about today, the key difference out there is economy and technology, and how globalization has played out. Because what the key term that you may be hearing all the time, the resilience of supply chains, that became an issue once we realized that under a globalized trade, you can no longer only focus on efficient supply chains, because what may be efficient, which means what may be cheaper, that was the reason why all these multinational giants started to shift their factories to China. Not because they were in love with China, but because China became the manufacturing hub of the world, because labor there was so cheap, Whereas in the Western countries, because of constant demographic decline, because of high standards of labor, etc., it became very, very expensive. So an Apple, which is an American company, I'm just giving you a very, very basic example. I'm sure you know it. But so there was a reason how China became a manufacturing hub of the world. So long and short is that even though it remained to be the cheapest way to manufacture something, COVID for the first time told us that what may be efficient may not be resilient, which means that in times of a crisis, the efficient model of making something cheap is not going to save the world economy because of, a certain kind of an economic statecraft that China by then has also started to, project in the world. And that is why there is a reason that most of the Western countries started to come up with their Indo-Pacific strategies in 2019 or so, when they started to understand, and this is before COVID, remember, COVID started in 2020. So in 2019 is the time when most of the European countries also start coming out with the Indo-Pacific strategies, understanding that China has a particular objective in mind with all the economic statecraft. It is not just it is not just plain economics, okay? So one thing that changes is the globalized trade and the way, the realization that efficient supply chains and efficient production chains do not mean, resilient and chains, and therefore there was so much focus on resilience of supply chains and production chains. Second was over-dependency for manufacturing was also something which did not exist in the Cold War. Third was the technological and the digital, revolution, which did not exist in the Cold War. And by here, I'll quickly give you three examples, and it will sort of clarify a lot of your doubts, which is that the world that you see today primarily has three kinds of world orders. So you have a global security order, which is by and large dominated by the United States, which remains to be the world's largest military. Even though in certain areas you see that China has numerical superiority, especially in the naval domain. But even then, there's no doubting the fact that the US has formidable presence more than any other country that we've known. So the global security order is still pretty much dominated by one country, which is the United States of America. Then comes the global economic order. Now, even though the United States of America happens to be the biggest economy by sheer size, but the global economic order is more multipolar in its projection, because you see that the G7 alone cannot function. You need a G20. There is a BRICS. There is a middle order group of countries that are playing very, very important role. So even when it was there during the Cold War in terms of the OPEC countries and the oil, but the kind of multipolarity that you see now in terms of economies of skill versus economies of scale, in terms of, the discourse on climate, all that has given a very, very different tenor to how the global economic order has unfolded. So despite US being the largest economy, you do see that there is more multipolarity here. There is a BRICS grouping, there's an SCO grouping, there is, different African Union, there's an ECOWAS, there is, a community of Latin American countries, so on and so forth. There is European Union, etc. Then there is a global digital order. And the interesting thing about the global digital order is that the global digital order, artificial intelligence, etc., semiconductors, those things are right now evolving very, very fast. And the contours are being now decided. I mean, the contours are only emerging, the question on data, etc., what role will, controlling data is going to play, etc., machine learning, artificial intelligence. The interesting bit about the global digital order is that whoever controls or dominates, let's not say control is a very extreme term, whoever dominates the global digital order is going to, in turn, dominate both the global economic order as well as the global security order. And that is a fundamental difference that you do not see when you talk about the classic Cold War. So we have to keep that in mind. And that is why, I keep saying that today India's defense relationship, for example, are not the Cold War era defense relationship about buying and selling weapons, importing weapons. Today, India's new age defense relationships, for example, with countries like the United States, despite all the problems we have with countries like France, countries like Israel, they are important not only because we are diversifying our weapons procurement. That's not so simple. This is because it is also connected at the very base, at the very fundamental, with a very strong convergence in technological innovation. Okay, and that is why the scene is very, very different. That did not exist earlier. So today, it's not just about having an aircraft, but it is also about sort of developing an entire ecosystem around it, which takes much more than merely buying an aircraft or buying some missiles and putting them on the aircraft. So it's a small example, but I just wanted to give you that how I see the basic difference between just a simple Cold War that unfolded for 40 years before Soviet Union collapsed and a kind of a Cold War 2.0 that we see now, which is in many ways much more complicated with many more variables in today's times.
Yeah. And since we had only requested for 40 minutes and there are a lot of questions, so I'm going to just cut short 2 questions in one line. And that would be the end of it. I apologize from my side to all the scholars, others who have texted the question. The 2 questions basically are, Akhil is asking that would Taiwan be a similar mistake for China as Vietnam was for US or Afghanistan was for Soviet Union? And second question, which is being asked by Mahati Sagar, who's joining us from Middle East, is that do you think that IMEC and BRI would have futuristic conflicts?
Okay, so first, can Taiwan be Vietnam? See, we would like Taiwan to become Vietnam, right? One of the ways in which we sort of dissuade through strategic discussions is that, well, China is also seeing that not just Vietnam is a very, very old example. Look at what is Russia letting itself undergo in Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is a very small country. Earlier, the argument was that it is being propped up by the US, and then after Donald Trump came, we don't see the same kind of support at all. In fact, he's not given any new aid to Ukraine, and Ukrainians are still fighting. And Russia, in many ways, completely mired into that conflict. So much so that it has kind of lost its global outreach, its weapons exports, its presence in Middle East and Caucasus. I mean, all of that is completely changed because of its a badly calculated war in Ukraine, okay, which it's taking so long to win. So one part is that why talk just about Vietnam? Vietnam is from a different era. Even if you talk from the same era, you see that it is difficult for conventional conflicts to pan out in a way that great powers would want. And Russia-Ukraine is a great example. Yeah, I'm sorry. I think the link just, the internet just, went and came back. Yeah, in fact. So I think it's much more important to give an example from there, which is that it is very difficult for great powers. Of course, Vietnam is a good example. So it's Afghanistan, Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. You can keep on giving these examples. So we would want that it could turn out like that, even if not militarily speaking, even though Taiwan is really investing a lot in their capabilities. The other problem also comes with the status of Taiwan, because please remember that Taiwan is not really an independent country, officially speaking, and the other question is coming from the strategic ambiguity, which is that what exactly is the United States of America going to do? Is it really going to sort of get into a full-fledged war with China or not? Or is it more going to do with gray zone, indirect methods, for example, putting sanctions, etc.? And that is also the reason why when the Russia-Ukraine war started, I don't know if you know, that China started a very detailed study of how the secondary sanctions can impact another country. China is the only country that we know, and we were tracking it right from the beginning, that they put together a lot of study groups, etc., in how to circumvent secondary sanctions, what is the impact of secondary sanctions, because they have Taiwan in mind. Similarly, one of the quid pro quos of the Russia-Ukraine war between China and Russia is that Russia is giving first-hand information of how Western weapons perform in real-time war. Okay, so that's also another key takeaway. So they are preparing for it. I do not know if Taiwan will be in a position to sort of hold it. Let's remember, they did change the status of Hong Kong, and the world couldn't do anything. So Taiwan is going to be much more difficult. There is no doubt about it. Also because it will draw Japan into the conflict. Remember that the Senkaku Island dispute that the Japanese have with the Chinese is basically between Japan and China, in that region. So if there is an attack on Taiwan, the Japanese Senkaku Islands will get automatically sucked into it, and Japan will automatically become a party to that war. And in that case, Japan and the US have a security treaty where explicitly the US is supposed to come and help. So China is mindful of all that. In my opinion, okay, cutting a long story short, because I know the time is running out, cutting a long story short, I would be of the opinion that China would try to ramp up pressure enough on Taiwan in a way that, also remember, Taiwan is a very, very vibrant democracy, and not all parties within Taiwan really are that pro or anti-China, right? Some of them are also talking about a peaceful reunification, if at all. And that is why in the Western rhetoric, you always say China cannot take Taiwan by force, which means that in case Taiwanese themselves want to go and reunite with China, they can, right? So this is again a wordplay, but what it tells us that there is more than what meets the eye. So let's hope, if at all China tries to do anything that stupid, it becomes another Vietnam for them. But I think the Chinese CCP thinks very differently. So I don't think they will do anything like this, which is going to harm themselves. But then I can't be sure myself, so I would let that be. The second question was, Shubhata, what was the second question? Quickly.
The futuristic competition between BRI and IMEC.
Oh, yeah, BRI and IMEC. See, the futuristic competition, you don't really need to go that far. Right now, the BRI was started in 2012, and by now, BRI is, I don't know, I think, 30 trillion or something? It's massive. I'm not able to recall the figures right now, but BRI is a massive infrastructure project which sort of ensures that China dominates the world trade, connectivity. And it's already been running, in so many parts of the world. So whether you pick up, I gave you some examples of the Indo-Pacific, whether you look at Africa, 52 out of 54 countries in Africa are all signatories to BRI. So Africa, in China is their largest trading partner. I mean, look at the Middle Eastern region. Look at the way China is making inroads there. So, I mean, BRI is already there. It's been there since 2012. Compared to that, IMEC has not even started. Yeah. In fact, IMEC is an idea to connect the Indo-Pacific, especially, why say just, like a confusing Indo-Pacific. Let's say it's to connect India to Europe via the Middle East. And because the Middle East remains mired in conflict, the fact of the matter is that in many ways, IMEC has been declared dead on arrival because of this many logistics issues and the many strategic issues. I mean, can anybody tell us when the stabilization is finally happening in the Middle Eastern region? And the second thing is, please remember, IMEC is a project which is backed by the G7. It is a PGII-backed initiative, which means that ultimately the money that is going to come to IMEC is not going to come from, say, a party like a CCP. Okay, it is not going to come from anybody's state. It is going to come from private capital. So the question still remains as to how and when can you foresee a situation where private capital is de-risked enough to be able to come. So IMEC is a wonderful concept. I myself have been a huge supporter, of IMEC. But my opinion is that we should not be waiting for the situation in the Middle East, and particularly Haifa and all, to stabilize. It will happen sooner than later. Even now, India is trading both with the Middle Eastern countries as well as with European countries. The idea is to develop more strategic gateways in India's presence so that whenever the situation is conducive, IMEC can take off. And once IMEC takes off, from India's perspective, it is not going to be against anybody. And we will make sure, from our perspective, also from many European perspective that I have spoken to, that IMEC is always going to be about building complementarities and not about sort of, a mutually exclusive group. But how that pans out, I think we will sort of, we will look at it when we come to it. I think we are right now quite far from there, actually.
Yeah, we are. And with this, I would like to, on behalf of all of us, thank you for the privilege of your time. One thing which is very rare when, policymakers, academics of the stature of ma'am come and spend their time selflessly for the empowerment of the masses, taking us out from the morass of ignorance. That is something which is very rare. And I find it very, very inspiring. And the fact is that if you're learning from this, maybe in future you also do it when you go to that level. So thank you, all of you, for the privilege of your time today, and hope to see you all again. And thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing so much.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure, Shubhata. And all I can say is that we need more people in the strategic community. There is so much happening in the world, and especially we need more women,
Yes.
So I will always support anything that is women-led, because I truly believe in that. And I truly believe that there's a lot in this side, of the world that should be mainstream. So I do my bit, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, all of you. The talk would be posted online on our YouTube channel within 3 days, and I will share the link on the WhatsApp group. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. All the best.
Bye.